Okay, let's unpack this. Picture this scene. It's literally a minute past midnight, February 2nd, 2025. Somewhere in Berlin, maybe a small tech office, a software lead is hitting confirm on a command.
A command that shuts something down.
Exactly. At 00.01 sharp. A facial recognition pilot project, something they've probably poured months, maybe years into, just goes dark permanently.
And the timing isn't random.
Not at all. That specific moment. That's when a really significant part of Europe's big AI Act becomes legally binding. The ban on certain AI uses, including, well, with very tight exceptions, real-time facial recognition by police in public spaces, just clicks into force.
Wow. So not theoretical anymore.
Definitely not. This isn't just policy papers or academic debates now. The rules, the actual frameworks governing how AI gets built, deployed, used, they're here. They have hard deadlines.
And that Berlin scene, someone actually typing shut down, that's a pretty powerful symbol.
It really is. It's tangible proof that this global race, the one to implement and actually comply with AI governance, it's officially on. And not just in Europe. It affects companies, developers, everywhere.
Yeah, what's really striking to me is just how fast this has moved. I mean, a few years back, it felt like we were mostly talking high-level principles. AI should be ethical.
Vague aspirations.
Right. And now we're talking specific, legally binding obligations, things with real teeth, massive fines, even outright bans on certain applications. Companies are wrestling with this incredibly complex, sometimes contradictory global web of rules.
And individuals, too, are starting to feel it, right? In the AI services they use day to day.
Absolutely. The impact is becoming much more direct.
Okay. And that leads us right into our mission for today's deep dive. We've got all these sources you shared, the articles, the legislative summaries, the analysis, and we're going to sift through them, pull out the absolute need-to-know insights.
Kind of cut through the noise.
Exactly. Think of it as giving you a shortcut, a way to get genuinely well-informed on this incredibly crucial, complex topic, navigating this global labyrinth of AI governance.
Sounds good. So we'll start by really pinning down what AI governance actually means, like how it's different from policy or just compliance.
Yeah, let's nail that down first. Then we'll really dig into the big global players, Europe, the US, China, because their approaches, their whole philosophies are fundamentally different, and that shapes everything.
And then look beyond them, too. There's a lot happening elsewhere.
Definitely. We'll zoom out, touch on other national approaches, then look at how companies are actually trying to build systems internally to manage all this.
The whole ecosystem around standards, testing.
Right. And then we'll jump into some of the really hot debates, the kind of contentious issues that are still shaping the future of AI rules.
And finally, try to boil it all down. Make it practical.
Exactly. Distill it into practical takeaways for you, the listener, whether you're, hands-on building AI systems or just living with AI more and more every day.
Okay. It's a huge landscape, but definitely essential to get a handle on right now. Where should we dive in first?
Let's start right at the beginning. This term, AI governance. We hear it thrown around a lot, often alongside AI policy or AI compliance. The sources draw a clear line, though. What is that distinction, really?
Yeah, that's fundamental. They are related, definitely, but not the same thing. Think of AI policy as the top level. It's the what. It sets the big goals, the values, the high-level principles a company or country commits to.
Like our AI will be fair.
Exactly. Or AI should benefit humanity. It's the statement of intent, the guiding star, if you like.
Okay, so policy is the vision, the what.
Yeah.
Where does AI governance fit in?
Governance is the how. It's the engine room. It's the actual practical operational framework you build to make those policies real and, critically, to manage the risks that come with AI throughout its entire life.
So not just a document.
Oh, definitely not. It's a whole system. It involves setting up structures, maybe an AI ethics committee, or appointing a specific person, like a chief AI officer who's responsible. It means putting processes in place, like doing risk assessments before you deploy something.
Those algorithmic impact assessments, or AIAs, the sources talk about?
Precisely. AIAs are a key governance tool. It also means having continuous monitoring, figuring out who's accountable if things go wrong, making sure there's human oversight where it matters, and having ways to trace decisions back traceability.
So it's ongoing, proactive.
Yes, proactive and systemic. It's the whole system of checks, balances, and oversight designed to build and maintain AI you can actually trust.
Got it. Policy is the what, governance is the how, the operational machinery. So where does AI compliance slot in?
Compliance is a specific piece within that larger governance framework. It's really about ticking the boxes, making sure you're adhering to the specific existing codified laws and regulations out there that apply to your AI.
Like GDPR for data privacy, or the specific rules for high-risk AI under the EUAIAct.
Exactly. Compliance is often seen as reactive. What do we need to do to follow this law and avoid getting fined? Governance is much broader, more strategic. A good governance system makes sure compliance happens, sure, but it also deals with risks before they're regulated, builds that crucial trust, and aligns AI development with the organization's values.
It's about building something sustainable, not just avoiding penalties.
Precisely. It's about responsible development as a core practice.
And the sources mention different levels of maturity here, like informal versus formal governance.
Yeah, they do. Informal is basically crossing your fingers. Ad hoc is, putting out fires as they flare up. Formal governance is where organizations need to be heading. It's structured, it's documented, it's integrated across the business. It anticipates problems.
Embedding responsibility from the start.
From design all the way through to decommissioning, yes. And the point the sources make is that formal governance isn't just good hygiene anymore. It's actually becoming a strategic advantage. Companies that can show they have robust governance, they're better placed to build trust, access markets like the EU with strict rules, and ultimately compete more effectively.
Trust seems to be the recurring theme here. And the sources break down trustworthy AI into these core pillars or dimensions that governance aims to uphold. What are those key elements?
Right, and they really are pillars. They all need to be strong for the whole thing to stand up. If one's weak, the structure's compromised. First, and maybe most obviously, is safety and security.
Foundational.
Absolutely. AI systems have got to be reliable, robust, resilient. They shouldn't cause harm by accident, and crucially, they need protection against deliberate attacks. Things like data poisoning or adversarial examples designed to trick the AI.
Okay. Safety and security, what's next?
Ethics. This goes beyond just the legal minimums. It's about making sure AI is developed and used responsibly, aligns with human values, and actually contributes positively to society.
Makes sense. What else?
Transparency and explainability. This is huge. People should know when they're dealing with an AI. And for decisions that really impact people's lives, there needs to be a way to understand how the AI reached that conclusion.
Like what data went in, what was the logic?
Exactly. That explainability is vital so people can actually question or challenge an outcome they think is wrong.
And related to that, accountability.
Yes. Who is ultimately responsible for how an AI system performs and its impact? Good governance needs clear roles, proper human oversight where human judgment is still needed, and traceability, the ability to track the data, the model version, the process that led to a specific output.
You mentioned GDPR earlier. Privacy must be a big one.
Critical. Privacy is a major pillar. AI often needs vast amounts of data, sometimes very personal, sensitive stuff. So following data protection laws like GDPR, handling data securely, getting proper consent, these are all non-negotiable parts of AI governance. Then there's fairness and impartiality. This is about actively working to ensure AI systems are inclusive and equitable. Identifying and mitigating bias is key here.
Bias that can creep in from the data or the design.
Both. Bias training data is a common source, but bias can also come from the way the algorithm is designed or how it's deployed in a specific context. The goal is to prevent AI from just reflecting, or worse, amplifying existing societal discrimination.
And looking even broader, at society level.
That brings us to human rights and democratic values. AI systems need to respect fundamental rights, dignity, autonomy, non-discrimination. Governance has to tackle risks like AI being used to create and spread disinformation at scale, which, as we know, can seriously harm democratic processes.
One more the sources mentioned was market competition. That seems slightly different.
It is slightly different because it's less about the AI system itself and more about the ecosystem, but it's a governance concern. The worry is that the huge resources needed for cutting-edge AI could lead to just a few big players dominating, potentially stifling competition and innovation from smaller players. So governance frameworks sometimes consider these broader market impacts too.
Okay, that's quite a list. Safety, security, ethics, transparency, explainability, accountability, privacy, fairness, human rights, and market competition. You had an analogy about building a house. How does that connect these?
Right, the house analogy. So think of the AI policy as the architect's blueprint the vision for the house. Compliance is like making sure the wiring meets the electrical code, the plumbing meets the plumbing code, specific rules.
Got it.
But AI governance is the whole building project and living in the house afterwards. It's hiring good contractors, managing the build, doing quality checks all along the way, making ethical choices like using sustainable materials, getting inspections, having insurance, and planning for ongoing maintenance and maybe future renovations.
And the pillars.
The pillars, safety, fairness, privacy, all those dimensions, they are the foundation and the load-bearing walls. If your foundation is shaky on fairness, or a crucial wall like transparency isn't sound, the whole structure of trustworthy AI is unstable. They all need to be strong and work together for the house to be safe, reliable, and fit for purpose.
That really drives home that governance isn't just ticking boxes. It's about building something solid and reliable end to end.
Exactly. It's a continuous process of ensuring structural integrity.
Okay, that gives us a really solid handle on what AI governance actually involves. Now let's zoom out to that global picture. The sources hammer home that we're seeing three major, quite distinct approaches taking shape: Europe, the US, and China. Why is understanding these differences so important?
It's crucial because they stem from really different core philosophies and national priorities. They represent the dominant models that other countries often look to or react against. You've got the EU's very comprehensive risk-based approach. Then the US, which is much more fragmented, market-focused, and China's system, which is very centralized and state-controlled.
Let's dig into Europe first. The EUAIAct. We hear it called the first major comprehensive AI law globally. What's its core idea?
It's defining features that it's a regulation, meaning it applies directly across all 27 EU countries, creating a harmonized market. And its core idea, as you said, is that risk-based approach. It sorts AI systems into different categories based on the level of risk they pose to people's health, safety, or fundamental rights. Think of it like a pyramid.
Okay, tell us about the levels of that pyramid. What's at the top?
At the very top, the peak, are unacceptable risk systems. These are AI practices the EU considers a clear threat to its values and rights, so they're just flat out banned.
Banned outright. Like what?
Examples given include government-run social scoring systems, like you might see elsewhere, AI designed to manipulate people's behavior subconsciously in harmful ways, and the big one we mentioned, using real-time remote biometric ID, like facial recognition, in public spaces by law enforcement.
Though there are exceptions.
Very narrow exceptions, yes. Like finding a specific missing child or preventing an imminent terrorist threat, and even then, usually requiring prior judicial approval. But the general principle is a ban.
And those bans, as we establish, they kick in really soon, February 2025.
That's the first big deadline, yes, a clear signal of intent. Below that top tier, you have high-risk systems. These aren't banned, but because they operate in sensitive areas where things could go badly wrong, they face a whole raft of strict obligations.
What kind of areas are considered high risk?
The Act lists them out. Things like critical infrastructure management, education and vocational training systems, employment and worker management tools, access to essential services like credit or benefits, law enforcement tools, migration and border control systems, and systems used in the administration of justice. Pretty much anywhere AI decisions can have a major impact on someone's life or rights.
And what do companies have to do if their AI falls into this high-risk bucket?
A lot, especially for the providers, the ones developing the AI or placing it on the market. They need rigorous risk management systems throughout the AI's life cycle. They need high standards of data governance for the data used to train and test the AI. They need detailed technical documentation explaining how it works. They must ensure appropriate human oversight is possible.
Accuracy, robustness,
Oh.
cybersecurity.
All of that, yes. And crucially, they have to conduct a conformity assessment, basically, proving they meet all these requirements before they can sell or deploy the system in the EU. Deployers, the organizations actually using the high-risk AI, also have duties, like monitoring its use and doing fundamental rights impact assessments, or FRIAs.
Which can link up with GDPR's impact assessments.
Exactly. The sources suggest combining them where possible, FRIA and DPIA, to streamline things.
Okay, so high risk means a lot of process and proof.
Yeah.
What about the tiers below that?
Below high risk is limited risk. The main concern here is transparency. People might not realize they're interacting with AI or seeing AI-generated content. So the main rule is just transparency. You have to tell people. If you're using a chatbot, disclose it's an AI. If you're putting out a deepfake image or video, label it as AI-generated.
Pretty straightforward. And the bottom level?
Minimal risk. This is expected to be the vast majority of AI systems out there. Think spam filters, most recommendation engines, AI in video games. The Act pretty much leaves these alone, reflecting the idea of not wanting to over-regulate where the risks are negligible.
What about the big models, the foundation models, what the Act calls general-purpose AI or GPAI?
Right, they get special attention. All GPAI providers have some baseline transparency duties, documenting their model, providing info about training data, things like that. But then there's a subset deemed to pose systemic risk.
And how do they figure out what's systemic risk? Is it size?
Primarily, yes, at least initially. The main trigger mentioned is the sheer amount of computational power used for training. If a model was trained using more than 10 to the power of 25 floating point operations per second, or FLOPs.
125 FLOPs, that's a huge number.
It's massive. That creates a presumption of systemic risk, though companies can argue against it. If a model hits that threshold, or is designated systemic for other reasons, much tougher rules apply. They need to do thorough model evaluations, assess and mitigate systemic risks, conduct adversarial testing, red teaming, and report serious incidents to the new European AI office.
And the timelines for these rules are staggered.
Yes, it's a phased rollout. Bans in Feb 2025. GPAI rules, including the systemic risk ones, apply from August 2025. Most high-risk rules kick in August 2026. And then some specific high-risk systems embedded in other regulated products have until August 2027.
How does this all fit with other big EU laws, like GDPR, the Digital Services Act, DSA, the Cyber Resilience Act, CRA? Does it overlap or conflict?
The goal is complementarity, not conflict. The sources stress the AI Act builds on these existing frameworks. GDPR still applies fully whenever personal data is involved. The AI Act even clarifies things, like providing a specific legal basis under Article 10.5 for using sensitive data if it's strictly necessary to detect and fix bias in high-risk systems, which was a potential GDPR headache.
Streamlining where possible.
Exactly. For the big online platforms covered by the DSA, meeting their DSA risk assessment duties can also satisfy similar AI Act requirements for AI features they use. The AI Act's deepfake rules help with the DSA's fight against disinformation. And if a high-risk AI system meets the cybersecurity requirements of the newer Cyber Resilience Act, it's automatically considered compliant with the AI Act's cybersecurity rules, too. It's meant to be an interlocking system.
A complex one, though. Who enforces all this, and what are the penalties?
Enforcement is mostly national. Each EU country has to designate one or more national market surveillance authorities, MSAs, by August 2025. They'll monitor compliance, investigate problems, hand out fines. At the EU level, the new European AI office coordinates these national bodies and directly supervises the big GPAI models.
And the fines, you said they had teeth.
They certainly do. The sources mention fines up to 35 million euros, or 7% of a company's global annual turnover, whichever is higher, for breaking the rules on prohibited practices. For not meeting the high-risk obligations, it's up to 15 million euros, or 3% of global turnover. There are lower caps for SMEs, but these are potentially company-altering fines designed as a major deterrent.
Wow. Okay, so that's the EU. Comprehensive, risk-based, harmonized, phased in with serious penalties. But the sources also talk about an implementation gap. What are the big challenges?
Several big ones. First is just resources. Do the national MSAs actually have the technical expertise, the staff, the budget to effectively police this complex technology across 27 countries? There's a real risk of uneven enforcement. Second, the compliance cost is huge. Billions across the EU, potentially dampening investment, especially for smaller players.
And you mentioned a standards gap.
Yes, this is a critical bottleneck. The idea is that companies can show they comply with the complex high-risk requirements by following specific, detailed technical standards developed by official European standards bodies. Following these harmonized standards gives them a presumption of conformity.
Makes it easier to prove compliance.
Exactly, but the problem is developing these detailed standards takes time, and they're lagging behind. They're not expected to be ready until 2026 or even later for many areas. So companies have legal obligations coming due, but the agreed-upon technical blueprints for how to meet them aren't available yet. That creates a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, that's a deep dive into the EU model. Now, let's pivot to the United States. The sources call it a fragmented mosaic. That sounds completely different.
It really is philosophically miles apart. Instead of one big, overarching AI law like the EU, the U.S. approach relies on a patchwork. You've got existing federal agencies applying their specific expertise, the FDA on medical AI, the SEC on AI and finance, and so on. Then you have executive actions from the White House, voluntary frameworks, and crucially, a lot of activity happening at the state level. It's much more dynamic, decentralized, market-driven.
Let's break down that mosaic. What's happening at the federal level?
A lot of the current momentum comes from executive orders. President Biden's VO from October 2023 was pretty significant. It directed federal agencies to take various actions, strongly promoted the AI risk management framework developed by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and notably required developers of the most powerful AI models to report their safety testing results to the government. Now, here's where the sources introduce a really interesting potential dynamic, illustrating the U.S. approach's flexibility, or maybe volatility. They describe a hypothetical scenario. Imagine a new executive order comes out in, say, January 2025 under a potential Trump administration.
Okay.
The sources describe this hypothetical order as potentially aiming to revoke the previous one, explicitly to remove what it might call onerous government control, and instead focus on boosting America's AI dominance through deregulation and a strongly pro-innovation stance. Now, this is presented purely as a described potential policy shift from the source material, not our prediction.
Understood. But it highlights how much the federal direction could potentially swing depending on who's in charge, unlike the EU's fixed legislation.
Exactly. It really underscores the difference. Beyond EOs, that NIST AI risk management framework, the RMF, is very influential. Although it's voluntary for most private companies, it's widely respected and adopted. It gives organizations a structure, govern, map, measure, manage, for thinking about and handling AI risks.
What else federally?
The rules from the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, are important because they're binding on federal agencies themselves when they buy or use AI. These rules mandate things like agencies appointing chief AI officers, doing impact assessments for high-impact AI systems they use, and even include Buy American clauses for AI procurement.
And because the government buys so much tech?
Right. These procurement rules effectively set standards for any company wanting to sell AI products or services to the U.S. government. And then you have the enforcement agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, and the Department of Justice, DOJ. They're using their existing powers. The FTC is going after unfair or deceptive practices involving AI and algorithmic discrimination. Both the FTC and DOJ are looking hard at antitrust issues. Are big AI companies engaging in anti-competitive practices, like exclusive deals or concentrating resources?
So a mix of executive actions, voluntary frameworks setting norms, procurement rules, and using existing laws. What about Congress? Are they trying to pass a big federal AI law?
They're definitely debating it, but it's proving contentious. A major sticking point is this issue of federal preemption. Should a new federal AI law override or prevent states from passing their own, potentially stricter AI laws?
A classic federalism debate.
Exactly. The sources mention a real fight. For example, a provision passed in a House budget bill that would put a 10-year freeze on states enacting certain AI laws versus Senate proposals that might link preemption to federal funding for AI initiatives. It's being hashed out in key committees right now.
And while Washington debates, the states are moving ahead.
Absolutely. With no comprehensive federal law, states are becoming, as the sources put it, policy laboratories. They're experimenting with different ways to regulate AI. It's regulatory federalism in action.
Can you give some specific examples from the sources? How are states differing?
Sure. California, being a huge tech state, is looking at various things. They've passed some targeted laws already, and they're debating broader proposals. One mentioned is SB 420, a sort of AI Bill of Rights, which would require impact assessments for high-risk automated decision systems and give people rights to transparency and appeal. Then you have Texas, which passed a law called TRIGA. It's framed as more innovation-friendly, generally avoiding broad mandates, but specifically prohibiting intentional discrimination or manipulation via AI and reinforcing rules around consent for biometric data. And then Colorado actually passed the first really comprehensive state-level AI law, the Colorado AIAct. It creates a legal duty of care for developers and deployers to avoid algorithmic discrimination when AI is used for consequential decisions, things like hiring, housing, lending, insurance.
Wow, that's a real spectrum just between those three states. So if you had to sum up the core difference between the U.S. mosaic and the EU's pyramid.
Fundamentally different philosophies. The EU is building this single, harmonized, top-down regulatory structure for the whole bloc, driven by protecting fundamental rights, taking a precautionary approach. The U.S. is much more fragmented, relies on on sector-specific expertise, is more market-oriented, allows for bottom-up experimentation by states, and is generally more focused on fostering innovation, though that can shift with political winds. It's agile, maybe, but creates a real headache for companies trying to navigate 50-plus different potential rule sets.
Okay, EU and US covered. Let's turn to the third major regime, China. The sources describe its approach as distinctly state-controlled. How does that fit in?
China's system is again very different, driven by its own set of priorities, maintaining state control and social stability, while simultaneously pushing hard for technological leadership in AI. It's not one single law, but rather a framework built on several key, targeted, and legally binding regulations. It's quite interventionist.
What are those main regulatory pillars in China?
The sources highlight three main ones. First was the Algorithmic Recommendation Regulation, which came into force back in March 2022. This is actually quite groundbreaking globally because it specifically targeted recommendation algorithms.
Like the ones used by e-commerce sites or social media?
Exactly. Addressing issues like discriminatory pricing based on algorithms or the impact of algorithms on gig economy workers' schedules and pay. It gives users rights, like being able to see and edit the tags used to profile them, or opting out of personalization altogether. It also includes protections for workers subject to algorithmic management. The second pillar is the Deep Synthesis Regulation from January 2023. This one tackles deepfakes and other synthetic media head-on. It has strict rules, like requiring very conspicuous labeling of AI-generated content. And critically, it requires explicit consent from an individual before you can use AI to alter their biometric information, like their face or voice.
That seems quite strong. And the third pillar, generative AI.
Yes, the interim measures on generative AI services, effective August 2023. This was a landmark regulation aimed at services like ChatGPT offered to the public in China. The absolute core requirement is that any content generated must align with core socialist values and cannot undermine state power or national unity.
A clear content control aspect.
Very clear. Plus, providers of generative AI services that are seen as having public opinion attributes or social mobilization capabilities face extra scrutiny. They need to pass a security assessment and actually file details about their algorithms with the state regulator. Although the sources do note the final version was softened a bit from earlier drafts, for instance, specific fine amounts were removed, suggesting maybe a desire to balance control with not completely stifling domestic AI companies.
That emphasis on content, state values, and algorithm filing is radically different from the EU or US focus. How is this enforced?
Enforcement is very centralized and state-driven. The main player is the Cyberspace Administration of China, C, which oversees digital content, handles the security assessments, and manages that algorithm registry. Other bodies, like the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, MIIT, handle technical standards, and the State Administration for Market Regulation, SANAR, deals with market competition issues.
What are some unique features of China's system?
The mandatory cybersecurity reviews for certain systems, and especially that algorithm filing requirement, give the state significant visibility and potentially control over the AI being deployed. China also uses export controls on AI tech and data strategically, linking it to national security and economic goals.
So if we were to quickly recap the main drivers for these big three regimes.
Okay, broadly speaking, the EU is primarily driven by protecting fundamental rights and creating a trustworthy, harmonized market. The US is driven more by fostering market innovation, leveraging existing sectoral expertise, and allowing flexibility, though with ongoing debate about the right balance. And China is driven by ensuring state control, maintaining social stability, and achieving national technological advancement, often through direct intervention.
Let's try that traffic analogy again. How would it apply here?
Okay, so the EU is like installing a comprehensive, standardized set of traffic lights, speed limits, and road signs across the entire region. The rules are very detailed and vary depending on the type of road or vehicle, the risk level.
Makes sense. The US.
The US is more like a patchwork quilt of rules. Each town or state might set slightly different speed limits or have unique intersection designs. There's some federal guidance maybe, like highway standards, but lots of local variation and experimentation, very fragmented.
In China.
China is like a central traffic control center that actively manages the flow, especially on key routes or for certain types of vehicles it deems sensitive. The priority is maintaining smooth, orderly movement according to the state's plan, even if it means restricting certain movements or monitoring vehicles closely. Control is paramount.
That analogy really helps clarify the fundamental differences in philosophy and approach.
It's a useful way to think about it, I find.
Okay, we've got a good grasp of the big three. But AI is global, and the sources show activity well beyond just Europe, the US, and China. What else is happening out there?
Absolutely. It's not just those three. Many other countries are crafting their own approaches, and we're also seeing more international efforts to find common ground, even if it's often through soft law, non-binding principles.
What are some other key national examples mentioned?
Well, the UK is taking a noticeably different path, calling it pro-innovation. Right now, it's deliberately non-statutory. They've laid out 5 broad principles: safety, transparency, fairness, accountability, contestability. And the plan is for existing regulators, like the Information Commissioner for Data or the Competition and Markets Authority for Market Issues, to apply these principles using their current powers within their sectors. It's much less prescriptive than the EU.
Interesting. What about Canada or Brazil?
Canada has drafted a bill called ADA, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. It seems to take a risk-based approach, focusing on regulating high-impact systems with requirements for risk assessment and transparency. It also proposes creating an AI and data commissioner role. Brazil is working on a bill, PL 233823, that sounds quite similar in structure to the EUAIAct, using a risk pyramid, banning certain extreme uses, having strict rules for high-risk systems, and even tackling issues like using copyrighted material for training AI.
And places like India or Singapore.
India's main lever currently seems to be its new Digital Personal Data Protection Act from 2023. It doesn't target AI directly yet, but its strict rules around consent for using personal data definitely have big implications for how companies can gather AI training data in India. Singapore has had a model AI governance framework for a while. It's flexible, non-binding guidance, and they recently updated it to address generative AI specifically, adding dimensions like content provenance.
South Africa.
There's movement at the continental level, too. The African Union endorsed a continental AI strategy just this year in 2024. The goal is to eventually develop a model AI law for AU member states to adopt, building on existing agreements about data protection.
So a real mosaic globally, not just within the U.S. Are there efforts to try and connect these dots, maybe create some international standards or agreements?
Yes, definitely. There's a clear recognition that AI doesn't stop at borders. Several initiatives are trying to foster cooperation. The G7 countries, through their Hiroshima process in 2023, agreed on some high-level international guiding principles and a voluntary code of conduct aimed at developers of advanced AI systems. The OECD has been influential for years with its AI principles adopted by over 40 countries now. They promote trustworthy AI and respect for human rights. These are soft law but foundational. And the Global Partnership on AI, or GPAI, brings together multiple countries and experts to work on practical research related to these principles.
Are there any legally binding international efforts?
Yes, a major one just emerged. The Council of Europe finalized its Convention on AI, which opened for signature in September 2024. This is significant because it's intended to be the first international legally binding treaty specifically on AI. It sets out a framework for ensuring AI development and use aligns with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law among the countries that sign up. And even the United Nations General Assembly weighed in, unanimously adopting its first resolution on AI in March 2024. It calls for safe, secure, and trustworthy AI globally, linking it to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and upholding human rights.
So it sounds like a mix, individual countries setting rules, but also these international bodies trying to weave things together, sometimes with voluntary principles, sometimes with actual treaties.
Exactly. You could think of it like lots of different rivers, the national regulations flowing towards a global ocean. The multilateral initiatives, the OECD principles, the G7 code, the UN resolution, they're like shared navigation charts or agreements on currents. And then something like the Council of Europe Convention is trying to build a major binding shipping canal connecting many of those rivers, setting common rules for passage. The goal is to create some level of global coherence and avoid total chaos.
That makes sense. It's clearly a very dynamic and multi-layered global landscape.
Constantly evolving.
Okay, so we've got the global regulatory picture. Now let's bring it down to the ground level. How are actual organizations, companies, dealing with all this? The sources talk about a corporate playbook and the ecosystem of standards and testing that's emerging to support AI governance.
Right. This is where the rubber meets the road. It's about how businesses translate these high-level regulations and principles into concrete internal processes, structures, and technical measures. And they're not doing it in a vacuum. There's a growing infrastructure of standards and assurance mechanisms to help.
Let's start with standards. What role do they play?
International standards bodies are crucial for setting technical benchmarks. The big one for AI is ISO-IEC JTC1SC42. That's the Joint Technical Committee focused specifically on AI.
And they've produced some key standards.
Yes. The most significant one highlighted is ISO IEC 52001. This is the world's first international standard for an AI management system, or AIMS. Think of it like ISO 9001 for quality or ISO 27001 for information security, but specifically for managing AI responsibly within an organization. It provides a whole framework.
What about other standards?
There's the ICE P7000 series, which focuses more on specific ethical considerations like addressing bias or enhancing transparency. And then in Europe, bodies like CE and CINELEC JTC21 have the specific job of developing those harmonized standards we talked about earlier, the ones companies will use to demonstrate they meet the EUAIAct's requirements and get that presumption of conformity. Those are hugely important, but still under development.
So standards provide the how-to. How do AI systems then test it or evaluate it against these standards, or just for safety in general?
That's where this testing and assurance ecosystem comes in. A key development is the creation of national AI safety institutes. The U.S. has its AICI housed within NIST. The U.K. has its own AICI.
What do these institutes actually do?
Their main jobs are to evaluate the safety and security of the most advanced AI models, especially foundation models. They conduct research into safety risks and evaluation methods, and they act as hubs for sharing information between government, industry, and international partners.
And they're working together internationally.
Yes. The sources mention an international network of AI safety institutes. About 10 countries are involved so far, including the big players. The goal is collaboration, sharing research findings, developing common testing protocols, trying to align safety guidance so we're not all reinventing the wheel. It acknowledges AI safety as a global challenge. Then specifically within the EU system, you have the notified bodies.
We touched on them earlier. They're like independent certifiers.
Yeah, exactly. They are independent third-party organizations designated by the EU member states. For certain high-risk AI systems defined in the AIAct, providers must go through a conformity assessment conducted by one of these notified bodies before they can put their product on the market. They act as mandatory gatekeepers, verifying compliance, and separate from government institutes or notified bodies, you also have independent red team labs.
Ethical hackers for AI.
Kind of, yeah. These are specialized groups, some nonprofit like NPR, some initiatives like the ML Commons AI Safety Benchmark, Illuminate. They perform focused adversarial testing to really push the boundaries of AI models and find hidden flaws or dangerous capabilities.
Oh, what kind of capabilities?
Things the sources mention include testing for autonomous replication and adaptation, or ARA, could the AI copy itself and adapt to evade controls, or probing how models respond to prompts related to specific hazard categories, like generating instructions for building weapons or conducting cyber attacks. They're stress testing for worst-case scenarios.
Okay, so standards set the bar. Institutes research and test, notified bodies certifying the EU, and red teams try to break things. What are companies doing internally to manage all this?
They're building internal structures. Many larger companies have set up AI ethics boards or review committees. These usually bring together diverse experts, legal, technical, ethical, domain specialists to review proposed AI projects, assess risks, and provide guidance. A really significant trend is the emergence of the Chief AI Officer, the CAIO. This is becoming a senior executive role, often reporting directly to the CEO.
What's their remit?
They typically lead the company's overall AI strategy. They're responsible for establishing and overseeing the internal AI governance framework, ensuring compliance with all the relevant regulations, and managing the portfolio of AI-related risks across the entire organization. It signals AI governance is being taken seriously at the highest levels. Companies are also increasingly using external audits. Specialist firms, the sources mention names like Shellman, EY, BSI, offer services to audit a company's AI systems and their internal AI management processes against standards like ISO 42001. Getting certified against a standard like that provides external validation that you have a robust system in place. It builds trust.
And you mentioned earlier the algorithmic impact assessment, the AIA, as a key tool. How does that fit into this internal playbook?
The AIA is really becoming a cornerstone of operationalizing governance. It's that systematic process companies use before deploying an AI system, and often periodically afterwards, to proactively identify, analyze, and document potential societal impacts and risks.
What kind of things does an AIA cover?
The sources outline a pretty comprehensive structure. You'd identify the system and its intended purpose, detail the data being used, its source, quality, governance, assess the potential impacts and risks across multiple dimensions: fairness and bias, fundamental rights, safety, security, maybe even environmental impact. You'd analyze different scenarios, then outline the steps taken to mitigate those risks, the human oversight mechanisms in place, and how people can contest or seek redress for decisions. And finally, a plan for monitoring the system once it's deployed, including how incidents will be reported and when reassessment is needed.
It sounds like a really thorough piece of due diligence.
It is. And what's really interesting is how different regulatory requirements are converging around this idea. GDPR has its Data Protection Impact Assessment, DPIA. The EUAIAct has its Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment, FRIA. Canada and various U.S. proposals talk about AIAs. So for multinational companies, developing a strong, comprehensive AIA process can serve as a kind of master document.
A central pillar they can adapt for different places.
Exactly. It becomes a core component for managing AI risk responsibly and demonstrating compliance across jurisdictions.
Now, all this, the standards, the testing, the internal roles, the documentation, like AIAs, it sounds incredibly thorough, but also expensive. The sources brought up compliance costs, especially for small versus large companies.
Yes, that's a major concern highlighted. The overall cost of complying with regulations like the EUAIAct is projected to be substantial, potentially running into tens of billions for the EU economy, and there are worries it could dampen AI investment.
And the impact isn't equal.
No, the sources give a stark example. For a small or medium-sized enterprise, an SME, maybe with just a few million in revenue, if they want to deploy just one AI system that falls into the high-risk category under the EUAIAct, the estimated compliance cost could be around €400,000.
Wow, that's huge for a small company.
It could easily wipe out their profit margin on that product, maybe make it completely unviable. Compare that to large tech companies. They likely spent over €1 million just getting ready for GDPR, and the sources suggest they expect AI Act compliance to cost even more. But they have the resources to absorb that kind of cost much more easily.
So, is there a risk these regulations inadvertently crush smaller innovators? How are rules trying to address that?
Regulators are definitely aware of this potential impact. The EUAIAct, for instance, includes specific provisions intended to help SMEs. Things like giving them priority access to regulatory sandboxes, possibly offering reduced fees for those mandatory conformity assessments by notified bodies, and setting lower caps on potential fines.
Regulatory sandboxes. What exactly are those, and why are they helpful for SMEs?
A regulatory sandbox is basically a controlled environment set up by the regulator. It allows companies, especially smaller ones or startups, to test innovative products or services, including high-risk AI systems for a limited time under regulatory supervision. Sometimes this might involve temporary waivers or modifications of certain rules.
So they can test the waters without the full compliance burden immediately.
Exactly. For an SME developing a novel high-risk AI, getting it fully compliant from day one might be prohibitively expensive. The sandbox lets them test it, validate it, gather data in a real-world or simulated setting, interacting with the regulator, without facing that massive upfront compliance cost that could kill the project before it even starts. It's a way to try and balance safety and oversight with fostering innovation, especially among smaller players.
Okay, so this corporate playbook, backed by standards and testing, is essential but costly, and there are mechanisms like sandboxes trying to ease the burden, especially for SMEs.
That's the picture. It's like building that airplane we talked about. You need the detailed blueprints, standards. You need wind tunnel testing and flight simulators, safety institutes, red teams. You need internal quality control processes, governance, CAIOs. You need meticulous documentation, AIAs. And for commercial flights, you need official certification from aviation authorities, notified bodies.
And the compliance cost is the price of all that rigor.
Right. It's inherently more expensive for a small startup building a single experimental drone than for a giant like Boeing or Airbus with decades of established processes and deep pockets.
That analogy really clarifies the different layers and the cost implications.
Hopefully it helps put it in perspective.
Right. We've covered the rules, the global picture, how companies are responding. Now let's shift gears slightly and tackle some of the really big unresolved questions that the burning debates that are still shaping how AI governance evolves.
Yeah, these are the tricky areas where there's still a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about the best path forward. Policymakers, industry, researchers, civil society, they're all grappling with these trade-offs. For each one, let's frame it as a question for you, the listener, to ponder, then unpack the different sides based on the sources.
Okay, first up, Open source versus closed source models. The question for you is, should the most powerful AI models be released openly so anyone can inspect and use them, or should they be kept proprietary and tightly controlled by their developers?
The arguments for open source, often put forward by companies like Meta, really center on transparency and collective safety. The idea is if you make the model weights, the code, maybe even the training data public, then a whole global community of researchers can scrutinize it.
Find flaws the original developers might miss.
Exactly. Find hidden biases, safety vulnerabilities. Proponents argue this actually makes models safer in the long run than keeping them as closed black boxes. They also stress it levels the playing field, lets startups and academics build on the latest advances, fostering competition and innovation. Meta's position is that openness is key for tech leadership and collective safety assessment. On the other side, the arguments for keeping models closed, or at least regulating open source more tightly, focus squarely on the risk of misuse.
The fear that bad actors get powerful tools.
Precisely. The concern is that giving everyone easy access to highly capable models lowers the barrier for terrorists, rogue states, or even individuals to use them for dangerous purposes, designing bioweapons, launching sophisticated cyber attacks, creating hyper-realistic disinformation campaigns at scale.
Where are regulators landing on this? It seems like a tough balance.
It is. The EUAIAct, for example, initially had some potentially strict implications for open source, but the final version includes broad exemptions for most open source models, unless they qualify as posing systemic risk as a GPI. The U.S. doesn't have specific open source laws, but the sources mention discussions around export controls possibly applying even to providing support for training powerful models abroad, whether open or closed. And the EUAct does require transparency documentation like model cards for all GPAI, pushing for some level of disclosure regardless.
So the provocative question for you, the listener, is that potential safety benefit from widespread community scrutiny worth the undeniable risk of making powerful tools more accessible for misuse?
A central tension right now.
Okay, next debate. Size-based versus capability-based thresholds. Questions for you. How do we decide when an AI model is so powerful it needs special, stricter regulation? Should we base it on how big the model is or on what it can actually do?
Size-based thresholds use relatively objective metrics. The main one discussed is the amount of computing power, measured in FLOPs, used to train the model. We saw examples like California proposing a threshold over 126 FLOPs, or the EUAIAct using over 125 FLOPs as a trigger for presumed systemic risk.
The appeal is it's clear-cut, measurable.
Exactly. It gives developers a specific number to aim for or stay under. The problem, though, is that model efficiency is improving rapidly. You can get more capability with less compute than before. So a fixed FLOP threshold might quickly become outdated. It might miss smaller, highly efficient models that are still dangerously capable while catching large but maybe less risky ones. Capability-based thresholds try to address this by focusing directly on what the model can do. Does it exhibit certain emergent capabilities, surprising abilities not explicitly trained for? Can it perform tasks deemed high risk, like helping design chemical compounds or finding software vulnerabilities? The U.S. focus on dual-use foundation models capable of posing serious security risks is an example of this approach.
That sounds more relevant to actual risk, but maybe harder to measure.
That's the challenge. Defining and reliably testing for specific capabilities is much harder than just measuring compute. It requires ongoing evaluation by experts, like those in the AI safety institutes. So many approaches seem to be moving towards a hybrid. Maybe use a size threshold as an initial flag, which then triggers a more in-depth capability assessment. Colorado's law focuses more on the use case than the model size itself.
Interesting. So, provocative question. As AI models keep getting smarter and more efficient, does relying solely on a simple size threshold eventually become meaningless for gauging real risk?
A very practical question for regulators.
Debate number 3, liability models. This is about who pays when AI causes harm. Question for you. If an AI system messes up, causes a crash, makes a discriminatory decision, should the developer be held legally responsible automatically? Strict liability, or only if you can prove they were careless or negligent?
Strict liability means the maker of a defective product is liable for the harm it causes, period. You don't necessarily have to prove they were negligent. The EU is leaning this way, updating its product liability directive to explicitly include software, including AI, and creating a presumption that a defect caused the damage if it's too complex for the victim to prove otherwise.
Better protection for the person harmed.
That's the argument. It lowers the burden of proof for victims facing complex, opaque AI systems. The counter-argument, often from industry, is that strict liability could stifle innovation. If developers face unpredictable liability, even if they weren't negligent, they might be less willing to develop or deploy cutting-edge AI. Negligence is the more traditional standard, common in U.S. tort law. Here, the victim has to prove that the developer or deployer failed to act with reasonable care and that this failure directly led to the harm. It focuses on fault.
But proving negligence with AI can be hard.
Very hard. How does a victim get access to the data, the code, the internal testing logs needed to show the developer messed up, especially when dealing with a black box system? The burden of proof can be insurmountable.
So the question for you, in a world filled with increasingly complex and often inscrutable AI, is it fair or practical to expect the person harmed to carry the heavy burden of proving negligence?
A fundamental legal and ethical question being debated worldwide.
Fourth debate. Mandatory AI red teaming and incident reporting. Question. Should companies be legally required to stress test their AI for potential dangers and misuse before they launch it, and then be forced to report serious problems that crop up after launch?
The EUAIAct says yes, quite clearly. It mandates robust testing and validation as part of the high-risk requirements. For those systemic GPAI models, it specifically requires adversarial testing, or red teaming. And importantly, it includes mandatory reporting of any serious incidents involving high-risk AI to the national authorities after deployment. So, mandated pre-market testing and post-market reporting. The U.S. approach is different. The Biden EO required reporting of safety test results, but only for the very most powerful models, invoking specific national security authorities. There's no general, legally binding federal law forcing all AI companies to red team all products or report all serious incidents. It relies more on voluntary industry efforts, potential sector-specific rules, and government monitoring focused on those frontier models.
A clear difference in approach. So, the question, is mandatory testing and reporting across the board essential for public safety and accountability, or is a more targeted approach combined with voluntary industry action good enough?
A core policy choice with significant implications.
Okay, final burning debate. International enforcement gaps and regulatory arbitrage. Question. With all these different rules in different countries, what stops companies from just doing their riskiest AI work in the places with the weakest regulations, a race to the bottom?
This is the very real problem of regulatory arbitrage. If compliance is expensive or restrictive in Europe or California, a company might be tempted to move its AI development, testing, or even deployment to a jurisdiction with fewer rules and less oversight. This obviously undermines the effectiveness of stricter regulations elsewhere and could lead to unsafe or unethical AI proliferating from less regulated havens. Adding to the complexity are things like data localization laws, some countries demanding data stay within their borders, which clashes with the global nature of AI training and deployment. Also, the extraterritorial effect of laws like GDPR and the EUAIAct, they apply to companies outside the EU if they offer services to people inside the EU. This creates major compliance challenges and potential conflicts between national laws.
And potential trade disputes.
Yes, that's another layer. Could strict AI regulations be seen as unfair trade barriers under WTO rules? There's debate about whether existing international trade law is equipped to handle these new challenges posed by national AI regulations, potentially restricting global digital trade.
So the final provocative question, can we actually achieve effective global AI governance without much stronger international alignment and cooperation on rules and enforcement? Or is this fragmented world of competing regulations simply the reality we have to navigate?
Arguably the biggest long-term challenge for the whole field. These debates show just how much is still in flux, even as the first wave of regulation starts to take hold.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've journeyed through the definitions, the global landscape, the corporate strategies, and these critical ongoing debates. Let's bring it all home now. What does this complex picture mean practically for you, the listener, whether you're building AI or just using it?
Right. Let's translate all this into some concrete takeaways. Based on what the sources tell us, we can outline some key action points or areas of awareness for different groups.
Let's start with the builders, the developers, the deployers, the companies creating AI. What should be top of mind for them from a governance perspective?
Okay, first and foremost, know your risk tier. You absolutely have to figure out where your AI system falls on the risk spectrum, especially under frameworks like the EUAIAct or similar state laws. Is it unacceptable, high, limited, or minimal risk? Because that determines almost everything else you need to do.
Step 1. Risk assessment. What's next?
Second, build in continuous monitoring. Responsible AI isn't a launch and forget activity. You need ongoing processes to track how your AI is performing in the real world, its accuracy, its fairness, its security. Things change, models drift, new vulnerabilities emerge. Monitor, monitor, monitor. Third, budget for and conduct audits. Plan for regular internal audits of your AI systems and governance processes. And consider getting external audits against recognized standards like ISO 42001. It's not just about finding problems, it's about demonstrating credibility and building trust with users and regulators, designed for contestability and human oversight. Especially for impactful decisions, ensure there are mechanisms for meaningful human review or intervention. And critically, make sure there are clear, accessible ways for people affected by your AI's decisions to understand, question, or appeal those decisions. Give people recourse. And fifth, track the tangled web of cross-border rules. If your AI uses data from multiple countries, or if you deploy it internationally, you have got to stay on top of data localization laws, data transfer restrictions, and how laws like GDPR or the EUAIAct apply extraterritorially. It's complex, but essential for global operations.
That's a really solid checklist for anyone involved in creating AI. Now, what about for everyone else, the citizens, the users interacting with AI every day? What should they take away?
For users, it's largely about awareness and knowing your rights. First, be aware of your rights. You already have rights under laws like GDPR concerning your personal data used by AI. New laws like the EUAIAct are adding more rights, like transparency for chatbots and deepfakes. And depending on where you live, you might be gaining specific rights to challenge algorithmic decisions in areas like jobs or loans. Know what protections you have. Second, understand that this field is evolving fast. Regulations are struggling to keep pace with the technology. What's legal or best practice today might change tomorrow. So stay curious and informed about how the rules governing AI are developing. Third, recognize the different global philosophies at play. The AI assistant on your phone, the newsfeed algorithm, the translation tool you use, they might have been developed under very different regulatory assumptions depending on where the company is based or operates. This can subtly influence their design, their data practices, their safety features. Knowing about the EU's rights focus versus the US market focus versus China's control focus helps you understand the context. And finally, pay attention to the policy debates. Those burning questions we discussed. Open source, liability, testing mandates. The answers will directly shape the future AI landscape. They affect what AI gets built, how safe it is, and how accountable its creators are. Understanding these debates lets you participate in the conversation about the kind of AI future you want.
So wrapping it all up, why does navigating this complex, sometimes technical world of AI governance matter so profoundly for everyone?
It matters because these rules, these frameworks, they are fundamentally shaping the role AI plays in our society. They dictate what's allowed and what's not. They set the standards for how AI must function, how safe, how fair, how transparent it needs to be. They define your rights when you encounter AI systems. Ultimately, this governance structure is the foundation determining whether the AI being built all around us is trustworthy, reliable, and beneficial, or something else entirely. It's not just red tape. It's about the integrity of our AI-infused future.
It's like getting the user manual for the increasingly automated world we live in. Going back to that analogy of navigating a new city. If you're building there, you need the zoning map, risk peers, the building codes, regulations, the inspection processes, audits, AIA. If you're living there, you need to know the local laws, your rights as a resident, and who to call if something goes wrong. This deep dive, hopefully, has given you a better map and guide. That's the aim. We started this whole conversation with that image. Berlin, just after midnight, February 2025, a software lead hitting enter to shut down that facial recognition pilot.
And as we discussed, that act wasn't necessarily about stopping innovation in its tracks. In a way, it was governance functioning as intended, applying a specific rule designed by society through the EUAIAct to mitigate a specific risk deemed unacceptable to fundamental rights. It was the system working.
And if we had to boil down this entire deep dive into one single takeaway sentence from the sources, what would it be?
I think it would be this. Building and deploying trustworthy AI is now fundamentally as much about the paperwork, the processes, the audits, the oversight, the whole machinery of governance as it is about the clever algorithms and the code itself. The how is just as important as the what.
A powerful summary, and perhaps a final thought to leave everyone with.
Maybe just that achieving trustworthy AI isn't a task we can just delegate to regulators or to tech companies alone. The sources suggest it requires ongoing vigilance, engagement, and participation from all of us understanding the rules, questioning the systems, and demanding accountability to ensure AI develops in a way that truly serves humanity.